The chants rise, steady and relentless, like the beating of a drum no one can silence. The boy at the altar cannot understand the words, but he feels them all the same, each syllable pressing against his chest, stealing the breath from his lungs. His wrists tremble against the cords that bind them. The priests circle closer. To the crowd, this is the sound of devotion. To him, it is the sound of doom. Imagine being that boy. You are told that your suffering will feed the city, that your body is the bridge to the gods. The voices around you insist that you are chosen, sacred, necessary, but in your chest you know the truth. You are afraid. You are alone, and nothing about this feels divine. The priests move as if rehearsed, each gesture deliberate, each touch sanctified by words older than memory. They say the goddess Ishtar demands ecstasy, that only through the breaking of innocence can the fields bloom, can the armies triumph, can the rivers rise and fall in mercy. And so they take what is not theirs, cloak it in ritual, and call it holy. The boy cries out, but the sound is swallowed by chanting, by incense, by silence. What happens when faith becomes a mask for cruelty? What secrets did Babylon hide behind its gilded temples? Tonight, we uncover the forbidden rituals that history tried to bury, the horrific practices of priests who claimed to serve the gods, but instead served something far darker. The city of Babylon did not sleep. Torches lined the ziggurats like burning spines against the night, their smoke curling into the heavens as if even fire longed to reach the gods. In the marketplace, traders still shouted beneath the stars, offering dates and lapis, while soldiers leaned against carved walls, bronze weapons catching the glow. But at the heart of the empire, beyond the noise of trade and the laughter of common homes, stood the temples. They were not simply houses of worship, they were engines of power, and the men who moved within them, robed in linen and crowned with ritual, were more feared than kings. To the Babylonian imagination, the gods were not distant. They demanded constant proof of loyalty, feasts, sacrifices, blood, and ecstasy. Without them, the city might starve, the rivers might dry, enemies might breach the gates. Priests knew this fear, and they wielded it like a blade. When crops withered or the Tigris flooded, they whispered of divine hunger. When armies faltered, they spoke of divine shame. And always, the cure was the same. A ritual, performed in shadows, sealed by screams that never left the temple walls. Imagine the crowd outside, kept at a respectful distance. They smell incense drifting from within. They hear the faint echoes of chanting, but they do not see what happens inside the sanctuaries. For them, the mystery is part of the holiness. The less they know, the greater the awe. Mothers teach their children to bow when priests pass. Fathers remind sons never to question temple law. And slowly, generation by generation, obedience hardens into silence. Inside, however, silence takes another form. A boy or girl chosen for service learns quickly that devotion means surrender. They are told their innocence is a vessel, a gift to Ishtar, the goddess of love and war. But what is offered in her name is not worship. It is violation wrapped in sacred words. The priests call it divine union. The victims know it as something else entirely, a wound that never closes. Babylon glowed with gold and sang with hymns, but beneath the hymns lay a darker chorus, one of fear, coercion, and broken bodies. And this, more than the grandeur of its walls, is what truly fed the empire. They said the gods spoke through signs, and the priests alone could read them. A liver blemish on a sacrificial sheep could unseat a general. A cloud crossing the moon at the wrong angle could postpone a coronation. Even the king, wrapped in lions and lapis, waited for a nod from a man in linen. When the river rose too fast, when grain darkened with rot, when a comet scratched a white scar across the sky, the palace summoned the temple, not for comfort, but for permission. Power wore two faces in Babylon, and the quieter face was the one that decided who bled. You can picture the consultations that began as whispers and ended as decrees. The high priest arrives at night, sandals dustless, hair perfumed, a small smile that says he knows what the heavens intend. He asks for privacy. He asks for piety. He asks for the king's cooperation in a rite older than law. There is always a reason the ritual must be done now. An enemy gathering to the north, a plague among the cattle, a prophecy that has begun to stir like a snake under a basket. The room stills. The scribe waits, reed poised. What will the god demand this time? Outside, people learn the shape of these demands without ever hearing them spoken. A family with debts donates a child to temple service and finds their ledgers suddenly lighter. A widow brings her daughter to the gate and leaves with enough barley to survive the winter. A boy hungry for one more bowl of lentils agrees to an apprenticeship that ends at an altar, not a workshop. The words are always soft: offering, devotion, sacred bond. But the result is a ledger of bodies that no one tallies out loud. Ishtar's name bears the burden of it all. The goddess of love and war becomes a mirror that reflects whatever the priest wants the city to see. On festival nights, drums throb until the streets pulse like a living thing. The sacred marriage is proclaimed, the union of God and land, priest and vessel. Ecstasy promised as a bridge to blessing. Curtains fall, torches gutter. The crowd roars for the harvest they have not yet planted, for the victory they have not yet fought. At the center, a chosen body is raised like an offering. A mouth that was taught to sing becomes a mouth that cannot refuse. You might ask, did no one resist? They did, in the small ways that survive only as rumors. A mother who fled at dusk, a boy who swallowed his voice like poison, a priest's servant who left a gate unlatched. But fear is an artisan here. It shapes obedience into something beautiful enough to display. The temple feeds the city feeds the temple, and in the exchange, the sharp edges of cruelty are polished smooth. By dawn, the high priest steps into sunlight with hands that smell of cedar and wine, and the king announces that the gods are pleased. The crowd bows. The child is gone. Inside the great temples of Babylon, the world changed shape. Step past the gates, and the night outside dissolved into a theater of incense and gold. The air was thick, perfumed with myrrh and cedar, heavy enough to choke a boy's lungs. Braziers hissed. Shadows stretched long across carved lions and winged bulls, and everywhere you looked, eyes stared back. Not human eyes, but those of statues, gilded and painted, watching every tremble of your hands. Here, silence was not empty. It was commanded. Even the breath of a chosen vessel felt like an intrusion. Imagine walking barefoot across those polished stones, skin prickling beneath the linen garment they draped upon you. The hall narrowed as you approached the altar, where priests in tall headdresses swayed in rhythm to drums that pounded like a second heartbeat. They spoke a language older than memory, syllables that promised harvest and victory, but the meaning was never yours to claim. What mattered was that you obeyed, that your body stood still while theirs moved closer. The priests called it union with the goddess. To the outside world, this phrase shimmered with mystique, whispered as a holy secret, but in the shadows of the sanctuary it meant surrender stripped of choice. A child became a stand-in for Ishtar, a living vessel to be broken in the name of fertility. The first touch might be framed as blessing, the second as consecration, but each one drew the victim deeper into a silence they could never leave. No scream ever echoed long in these chambers. Drums drowned them, chants smothered them. And by dawn, the story retold to the crowd outside was one of triumph. The land renewed, the gods appeased, Babylon secure. People cheered, never knowing, or perhaps never daring to ask, what price had truly been paid. Those who survived rarely spoke. Some were kept in temple service, their childhood erased, their identity reshaped into a title that belonged to the priesthood. Others vanished entirely, their absence explained away as divine ascension. The families left behind clung to whatever crumbs the temple offered, convincing themselves their sacrifice had meaning. And so the cycle tightened, generation after generation, until cruelty no longer needed chains. It had been polished into tradition. Babylon was not blind. An empire that could raise walls so vast they swallowed horizons, that could carve gardens into the sky itself, did not stumble in ignorance. People knew. They always knew. Whispers trickled through taverns, lingered in markets, passed between mothers as they baked bread. But knowledge and resistance are not the same thing. Fear wrapped around the city tighter than any wall, and obedience became a survival skill as necessary as breathing. To speak openly of temple practices was unthinkable. The priests held the keys to harvests, to war, to the gods themselves. A single accusation of impiety could strip a man of his land, a woman of her marriage, a family of its name. Better to bow, better to nod, better to send your child with trembling hands than to invite the wrath of both heaven and earth. And so the city conspired with its own silence, choosing survival over defiance. Picture the crowded festival nights. Families gathered along the avenues, children perched on shoulders, waiting for the priests to emerge from the sanctuaries. The drums rolled, torches blazed, and the people roared with relief when the high priest announced the goddess was satisfied. They cheered, not because they believed every word, but because belief was safer than doubt. Doubt meant questions, and questions had a way of disappearing. There were stories, of course, that slipped between the cracks of silence. A servant swore he saw a child return from the temple unable to speak, eyes hollow as if emptied of soul. A mother whispered that her daughter, offered as a bride of Ishtar, came home with bruises hidden beneath layers of silk. These accounts fluttered through the city like moths, fragile and quickly crushed by the weight of official hymns. For every whisper, the temple had a song louder, brighter, easier to remember. The tragedy was not only in the rituals themselves, but in the way a whole people learned to live with them. Cruelty became heritage, and heritage became pride. The great walls stood not just to keep enemies out, but to keep secrets in. Babylon glittered in the eyes of the world, its hanging gardens a wonder, its ziggurats a marvel, but behind those marvels lay silence bought with suffering. And so, the city thrived while its children wept in hidden chambers. Babylon's glory was not built on bricks alone, but on the bones of those offered up in the name of faith. Kings in Babylon wore crowns heavy with gold, but it was the priests who gilded them with legitimacy. No coronation was complete without the blessing of the temple. No war could be waged, no treaty signed, until the high priest lifted his hands and declared the gods in favor. A throne might rest on a marble platform, but its true foundation was incense and ritual, bodies offered in chambers no outsider could see. Imagine the palace council chamber on the eve of a campaign. The king, armored in bronze, speaks of strategy, of alliances, of enemies gathering beyond the rivers. But before soldiers march, before swords are drawn, the priests demand a union. One more ritual, one more offering, one more child pressed into service. They claim the goddess must be satisfied, that victory cannot be won unless the land is first seeded with ecstasy and pain. The king nods, because to refuse is to risk not only defeat in battle but rebellion at home. The people believe the priests more than they fear their sovereign. In this way, the temple and the throne became inseparable. One wielded armies, the other wielded gods, and between them stood the innocent, bound and broken in the name of harmony. It was a pact written not on parchment, but on flesh. And every time a ritual ended in silence, every time a child vanished behind temple walls, the king's authority grew firmer, cloaked in divine approval. The irony was sharp. Those who ruled Babylon boasted of its greatness, its wisdom, its unmatched might. Yet their power leaned not on justice, nor on loyalty freely given, but on ceremonies that consumed the weak. The victims were told they were chosen, elevated, sacred. In truth, they were pawns in a game where gods were masks and priests were players. Still, the crowds cheered. Still, the harvest festivals continued. Still, the palace announced victories as proof that the gods had blessed their union. And in a twisted way, perhaps they had. For as long as fear held, as long as obedience endured, the empire flourished. Crops grew, armies triumphed, gold poured in. But beneath the splendor, rot spread quietly, a corruption not of soil or stone, but of spirit. Babylon's rulers believed themselves immortalized in glory, yet each ritual carved their legacy into a darker script, one written not in triumphal hymns, but in the cries that the world was never meant to hear. They called them vessels, chosen to carry the touch of the gods. But a vessel is not asked if it wishes to be filled. A vessel does not choose what it will hold. In Babylon, boys barely past childhood and girls not yet brides were led into temples with garlands on their heads and fear in their eyes. Their families told themselves it was honor. Their neighbors whispered it was fortune. Yet inside those walls, the word chosen became a curse. Imagine being one of them. You are lifted from the dust of the marketplace, scrubbed clean, dressed in linen that feels foreign on your skin. You are told you are sacred, that Ishtar herself has marked you. The priests smile, offering figs and honey, stroking your hair as if you are both beloved and condemned. You walk into a chamber heavy with incense, where statues loom and shadows flicker. There is no escape, only ritual. Ritual that begins with chants and ends with silence. Some did not return at all. Their families were given grain, perhaps silver, and a story that the child had been taken up by the goddess. To question this tale was to question the gods themselves. Others returned, but changed. Their voices grew quiet, their laughter brittle, their eyes distant. The temple might claim them again and again, each time deeper, each time darker, until they no longer remembered who they had been before. There are fragments in ancient texts, lines that scholars puzzle over, phrases about sacred marriage, about youths devoted to service, about ecstasy demanded by the divine. They are written in tones of reverence, but between the lines you can almost hear the echoes of those who had no choice. The language of holiness becomes a veil, hiding what the body remembers. These victims were the unacknowledged builders of Babylon's glory. For every banquet, for every victory, for every tower that reached toward heaven, there was a cost paid in innocence. Their suffering was not carved into monuments, not sung in hymns, not remembered in triumphal inscriptions. But if you listen closely to the silence between those lines of history, you can almost hear them. A breath caught, a cry swallowed, a story erased before it could even be spoken. Babylon thrived, but its brightest fires burned with stolen kindling, and the ones sacrificed to feed those flames were left in darkness. The city learned to forget on purpose. Centuries later, when scribes copied hymns and kings chiseled their victories into stone, there was no room on the tablet for those who had been consumed in the name of holiness. The rituals remained in the margins, hinted at in phrases about sacred unions, folded into euphemisms that sounded like poetry until you stood where the vessels once stood. Even scholars who came after, peering through cracked clay and broken seals, argued about meanings as if debate could soften the edges of what was done. Some called it metaphor, some called it fertility magic. Few dared to call it what the body would have called it, harm. Empires do not collapse from a single wound, but from 1,000 small ones that are never treated. Babylon's brilliance did not end the night a gate fell or a wall failed. It ended slowly, as trust curdled and fear replaced faith. When people learn that pain can be renamed as piety, they carry that lesson into the market, into the court, into the home. It teaches a father how to look away. It teaches a mother how to swallow her questions. It teaches a ruler how to confuse obedience with devotion, and under that grammar, cruelty becomes fluent. There were inevitably moments when the city's voice cracked. A priest accused of excess disappeared into exile. A scribe left a gap where a name should be, as if silence were a warning no censure could match. A traveler from another land wrote of Babylon's wonders but noted, almost casually, that the gods here were hungry. These are not confessions. They are fingerprints left on the glass. They tell you someone touched the truth and then pulled back, burned. By the time conquerors marched in, Babylon still glittered, but the shine had learned to apologize for itself. Gardens hung, water climbed, hymns rose, but the echo returned thinner each year, like a drum with a split skin. The priests insisted the gods remained pleased. Perhaps they did. Or perhaps the gods had long ago stopped listening, the way a river refuses to remember the tears that fell into it. What remains for us is not a verdict, but a choice about how to read the past. We can take the hymns at their highest note and call the rest mystery, or we can bend our ear to the ground and hear the lower register, the breath held too long, the chant that never meant rescue, the footsteps that did not lead back home. If we choose the second, then Babylon becomes more than a marvel of brick and myth. It becomes a caution that outlives its stones. And so, we arrive where every true story must, at the threshold between what was celebrated and what was suffered. Beyond this threshold lies the reckoning, the part where names are not carved into monuments but carried in the mouth, where the temple doors are held open long enough for the night air to find what was hidden. Step carefully. The next words belong to those who were never allowed to speak. The temple doors are long gone, their cedar splintered, their bronze hinges stolen for scrap. The ziggurats crumble beneath desert winds, and the once mighty Euphrates has shifted its course. Yet in the silence of ruins, the question still lingers. What was truly sacrificed in Babylon? Not only lambs and cattle, not only gold and wine, but lives, small lives offered up to a promise that pleasure and pain could summon the divine. The priests are dust, their chants forgotten, but the echo of what they did remains heavier than stone. History likes to paint Babylon as a city of marvels, a place where gardens climbed toward the heavens and astronomers charted the stars. And all of that is true. But beneath those stars, beneath the hanging vines, there were chambers where innocence ended in silence. If the empire dazzled the world, it was because someone, somewhere, paid the cost. Every brick bore not only the sweat of laborers, but the cries, swallowed by incense. Imagine standing there now, centuries later, at the foot of what once was a temple. The air is dry, the ground fractured, but for a moment you can almost smell the faint trace of myrrh. You can almost hear the drums. And in that moment, you understand. The rituals did not vanish because they worked, but because they failed. They could not save the empire they claimed to protect. They could not save the kings who bowed before them. And they could not save the priests themselves, whose names are lost even to the stones they consecrated. What survives is the warning that when faith is bent into a tool of control, when power drapes cruelty in holy words, the cost is always greater than the harvest, greater than the war, greater than the crown. The gods may have demanded ecstasy, but it was men who chose the victims. And men, not gods, must bear the memory of that choice. You do not need a tablet to write a name. You can carry it in the way you tell a story. So let us end the way Babylon never did, by saying aloud what was hidden, not as a curse, not as an indictment screamed into wind, but as a simple refusal to let silence be the last ritual. Imagine one of the vessels, years later, older than anyone expected, walking the edge of a canal at dusk. The reeds whisper, the sky pours copper into the water. They pause, touch the scar no amulet ever soothed, and try to remember a song the temple taught them, a hymn meant to promise blessing. The melody arrives, but the words will not. In their place comes breath, and with the breath, a truth that is not holy and does not need to be. I lived. What would it mean to honor that sentence? Perhaps to admit that glory without witness is only performance. Perhaps to say that a city is judged not by its walls, but by how many voices it must bury to keep the walls standing. The priests believed ecstasy could ransom the future. The kings believed obedience could purchase peace. Both learned, too late, that futures and peace are not currencies the body is willing to pay forever. Empires end. Secrets seep. The ground remembers. You and I are far from Babylon, but the grammar of harm travels well. It reappears whenever power renames pain as duty, whenever spectacle demands a volunteer and chooses someone who cannot refuse. It thrives in the spaces where we admire the garden and forget to ask who is watering it at night, and with what. The antidote is not rage alone. Rage burns too quickly, but attention, the slow, stubborn kind that makes euphemism flinch. Call a vessel a child. Call devotion what it is when it takes without consent. Call the ritual by the name the body gives it. If you stand among the ruins long enough, the wind will teach you how to listen. Not for drums, not for chants, but for the smaller sounds. A swallowed sob, a step that hesitates, the syllable, a mouth almost formed before it learned it should not. Collect those sounds, carry them out, set them beside the star charts and the garden plans and say, this too is part of the city. History is not a court that can punish the dead. It is a mirror that asks the living what they will do with what they know. Tonight we have looked into a dark pain and seen a temple that called cruelty sacred. Walk away with the light you have and hold it where language tries to dim. If Babylon taught anything worth keeping, let it be this: no offering is holy if it devours the one who offers it.